That's right. Today on Readiness Nation, I'll be revealing the absolute and definitive answer on everyday carry that is beyond all contestation. So let's get after it. I'm James Merritt, emergency manager and career soldier, and this is Readiness Nation. So the first question is, who am I to be settling this most hotly debated topic once and for all? Well, I started out in the Army as a combat medic, I commissioned as an infantry officer, and now I'm a civil affairs officer. And as such, over the course of my military career, I've carried a lot of different loadouts for a lot of different mission sets in a few different places around the world. I've run overt tactical loadouts with extensive medical supplies, overt tactical setups for maneuver operations, covert tactical setups with concealed body armor and weapons, missions where the status of forces agreement didn't allow for us carrying firearms, and even humanitarian aid work abroad where nobody had any weapons at all because it wasn't that kind of rodeo. So I have a pretty broad and diverse set of training and experience that informs my perspective on this. The second question, if you've seen my other videos, is how is the guy who said there is no such thing as universally best and there is no such thing as endgame gear in real life going to give us the definitive answer on what our everyday carry loadout should be? Well, the answer to that was in another one of my videos, which is that I work in modular scalable frameworks and analytical processes, not in prescriptions. So this video will be unlike any other EDC video you've ever seen because I'm not going to tell you specific pieces of gear you need to have. I'm going to walk you through the analytical process for you to determine for yourself what you need and what you don't. That way, not only will you be able to determine the best EDC for your circumstances, but moving forward, when new gadgets and gizmos come out and the people selling them say, "You need this new thing or you're gonna die," you can assess for yourself if that's something you actually need, and if it's not, be able to confidently say, "I don't need that. It will not enhance my scheme of maneuver." So the first point we need to discuss, and I'm not the first person to point this out, is that only what you actually carry every day is your EDC. When you start layering on additional capabilities for particular circumstances, that's not EDC, that's temporarily going to a higher security posture. The second thing we need to talk about is that most people who way overdo their EDC do so because they don't have a plan and they like toys. So they just strap on everything they think might be useful and then tell themselves they'll be ready for anything. You don't want to be that guy. You want to do your analysis, have a plan, and carry just the tools you'll need to execute your plan in as streamlined, low-key, and comfortable a way as possible. To that end, the next thing we need to talk about is your plan. So if you're new here, the foundation of my perspective comes from the Individual Readiness Framework. The Individual Readiness Framework is a scalable, modular, all-hazards planning framework that I developed from 5,000 to 6,000 pages of DoD and DHS doctrine. I lay it out in full detail in my book, and I give a comprehensive summary of it in the back half of my very first video. But what we're concerned with when we're talking about EDC are phases 0 and 1 of the Individual Readiness Framework. Phase 0 is what you're in right now. It's your planning and preparation phase. Phase 0 ends and phase 1 begins when an emergency happens. So your EDC is what you carry in phase 0 to be ready to execute phase 1. I further break phase 1 into subphases Alpha and Bravo. Phase 1 Alpha covers movement from wherever you are when the incident begins back to your vehicle. Phase 1 Bravo covers movement from wherever your vehicle is parked back to your house. So what you need to focus on here is that your EDC should just be what you need to carry on body to effectively make your Phase 1 Alpha movement. Anything you would need to make your Phase 1 Bravo movement should be in the trunk cache of your vehicle, whether those materials are to support your movement via motor vehicle or if it's to support your movement on foot. But what goes into preparing an effective trunk cache is a whole other video. So that begs the question, why is it so important that you only carry what you need and have a streamlined, low-key EDC setup? Well, there are at least 4 good reasons for this. As we discussed, only what you carry every day is EDC. So if your setup is too bulky, heavy, or cumbersome that you won't actually carry it because it's too unpleasant, it's not an effective EDC setup. Just like the best workout program is the program that you'll actually do every day, the best EDC is the EDC that you'll actually carry every day. Second, you never want to run the risk of losing or damaging a piece of equipment you'll need for a future phase of your operation by carrying it in a phase where you aren't expected to need it. Carrying stuff just in case, even though you don't plan on using it in Phase 1 Alpha, just jeopardizes that equipment needlessly. Instead, you want to stage that equipment where you'll be at the beginning of the phase in which it's actually needed. For instance, I'm hard-pressed to think of the circumstance that anyone would need a ferrocerium rod in their EDC because I can't imagine the real-life circumstance under which you would need to start a fire on the way back to your car. Now, does it make sense to have a ferro rod in your trunk cache? If your Phase 1 Bravo movement would take you more than 24 hours on foot, then yeah, it would probably be a pretty good idea to have a ferro rod in your trunk cache. So just stage your equipment where it's actually needed. Third, there are multiple considerations pertaining to not disrupting your social camouflage with your EDC. Now, if you haven't watched my last video on elements of effective social camouflage, I highly recommend it. This video and that one go hand in hand. But there are a few considerations about EDC and social camouflage I saved for this video. In the last video, I talked about how you never want to look like the hero. But in this video, we'll talk about how you never want to look like the villain. So this includes not having such a visibly obvious EDC setup that regular people think you're weird or potentially dangerous and thus don't want to interact with you, as well as not wanting your EDC to draw the close scrutiny of law enforcement at any level. But it goes further than that. If something goes down, you don't want anyone, civilian or law enforcement, to think that you're in on it. This is going to become a catchphrase around here, and that is, this is not a movie, this is not a video game, you are not the main character, you do not have plot armor, nobody knows who you are. And it's that last part that's most important to this conversation. If you're walking around every day looking like you're the guy who might shoot the place up if anything ever does go down, another armed citizen could easily mistake you for another active shooter or terrorist and engage you as such. Furthermore, when the police show up to a shooting call, they don't know who anyone is. So if you look like you could be the shooter, they're going to engage you as such. And if you survive that initial encounter, they're definitely going to treat you as a suspect instead of a victim. The last consideration is that having effective social camouflage and a tucked away EDC gives you a major tactical advantage. In any altercation, your assailant will have no idea that you even have any capabilities, let alone what those capabilities are. This will definitely facilitate your ability to talk your way out of the situation, and failing that, it will allow you to take your assailant by surprise when they're overly confident that they have the upper hand. So now that we've established that your EDC should only be what you'll immediately need to get yourself out of a bad situation and back to your vehicle, the question becomes, what are the things you should actually consider for inclusion? Beyond the normal human stuff that we're not here to talk about, like your wallet, your phone, your keys, and things like that, we first need to assess your day-to-day security situation and your legal and regulatory constraints for carrying weapons. You first need to identify what you can and can't legally carry in your area of operations. This is, of course, the first consideration that will limit your options. The second consideration you need to make is, what is the violent crime situation in your area of operations? You don't want to end up bringing pepper spray to a gunfight, so make sure that you fully understand your threat environment. Third, and you need to be real honest with yourself here, is what are you actually willing to use against another human being? Overwhelmingly, when someone's not comfortable using the level of force the weapon they're carrying generates, they hesitate to use it even after the legal requirements for use are met. This can easily lead to your weapon being taken from you and used against you in an altercation. Always remember, we carry lethal weapons to engage in lethal force, not to intimidate people. If you're not mentally and emotionally prepared to kill another human being, carrying a lethal weapon is more of a liability than an asset. Now, if you do decide to carry a firearm, do you need to have accessories on that firearm like a red dot sight or a weapons light? Maybe, maybe not. For any aiming device, the pertinent questions are, does it actually help you shoot better? Does it adversely impact the concealability of the weapon given the way you dress on a daily basis? Or does it adversely impact your ability to effectively draw that weapon from concealment given the way you dress on a daily basis? If the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second two questions is no, then go for it. If the answer to either of the second questions is yes, then the next question is, can you turn that yes into a no by altering the way you dress without violating any mandated dress codes or compromising your social camouflage? If yes, do it and run the red dot. If no, then don't worry about the red dot and just train enough with your iron sights to be proficient with them. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what sights you use as long as you can effectively engage your target. As for weapon lights, all of the previous questions still apply, but you also need to ask yourself, is there a reasonable probability that I'll need to use my weapon in a low light environment? If the answer is no, then never let anyone bully you into thinking you need to run a weapon light. This one is very circumstance dependent. If on the other hand the answer is yes, then run the light, but make sure you're training enough with it to build the muscle memory to instantaneously turn it on without thinking, or you're never actually going to use it when you're supposed to. Moving on to armor, the primary question is, what does the violent crime situation look like in your area of operations? If your primary residence or place of work is in a sketchy area, concealable soft body armor is not a bad idea. Just remember, it will be heavy and hot compared to regular clothing. So wearing it if you don't need it will just be draining for no reason. Additionally, keep in mind that soft body armor won't protect you from rifle rounds. And unless it's a specific type of reinforced soft body armor, it won't protect you from edged weapons either. Furthermore, this reinforcement will add weight and rigidity to the armor. So unless your analysis identifies that you're under threat from handguns or shotguns, soft armor won't be that useful. Though it is worth pointing out that about 90% of shooting deaths in the US, where the firearm type is known, are caused by handguns each year. The last basic category is medical supplies. As discussed, I started out in the Army as a combat medic, was a nationally registered EMT, and a combat lifesaver instructor, which is the Army's course to teach non-medical MOSs basic life-saving skills. So this subject is near and dear to my heart, and as such, I'm very concerned with how much nonsense has been promulgated by people who don't actually have any medical training. This will be its own video in the future, so I'll just make 2 points here. Tourniquets are really only needed for major vascular compromise in an extremity. So if your analysis identifies that there's a meaningful threat of limb amputation or serious laceration to an appendage in your area, then by all means, carry a tourniquet. If that's not a serious threat for you though, you do not need to carry one. If the majority of violent crime committed in your area is gun crime, then body armor is far more important than a tourniquet. If the majority of violent crime committed in your area is knife crime, then a tourniquet would be prudent. If the majority of violent crime in your area is committed with bludgeoning weapons, well, neither one is going to help you very much. The other point that I'll make about medical supplies and EDC is that in tactical combat casualty care, we don't render aid during the fight. Far too many medics died early on in the wars doing that. So instead, we fight the fight, win the fight, and then render aid. So if you finish the fight and secure the scene first, in most cases you can sprint to your car and retrieve a far more comprehensive medical bag from your trunk cache and have the right tools to render the needed aid, rather than probably having the wrong tools for the job because you're trying to carry medical supplies on body. Now that you've got the basics covered, you just need to look at what tools you need to support your Phase 1 Alpha movement. So how do you determine what tools you would actually need for that? First, you look at all the buildings you regularly visit in day-to-day life. Your work, gym, house of worship, the grocery store, the mall, your children's school, wherever you regularly go. Next, you need to identify all the routes of egress out of those buildings and back to your vehicle. Once you've identified all of those routes, you need to identify any obstacles or impediments along those routes. The tools you need to add to your EDC are what you need to negotiate these obstacles, and only what you need to negotiate these obstacles. Everything else gets staged where it's needed for future phases. So what kind of tools might that actually include? You could need things like a multi-tool with a wire cutter if there's a long chain link fence between you and your vehicle that would be a lot safer or faster to cut through than run around or climb over. It could also include a flashlight if there's an underground walkway between one of those buildings and a parking garage, or a windowless stairwell that could be without light due to the incident. If you work proximal to a facility that could have a major chemical spill or an industrial fire, an escape hood could be a good idea. There are various legal restrictions on carrying lockpicks if you're not a licensed locksmith, so check your local laws. But if there are locked doors or gates that would prevent you from taking the fastest or safest route back to your vehicle, lockpicks could be very useful to have if you're trained to use them. The point is, doing your analysis of the obstacles on your routes for Phase 1 Alpha will dictate what additional equipment, if any, you actually need to carry in your EDC. So if you analyze your security situation to determine your actual defensive needs, and you analyze your routes of egress out of the buildings you regularly visit to identify any tools you would need to negotiate any potential obstacles, you can ensure you're including everything you actually need in your EDC and only what you need. And making sure your EDC is streamlined and low-key enough that you avoid the close scrutiny of government actors, avoid being targeted by any other malign actors, maintain an approachable enough appearance that normal people will want to interact with you, while at the same time maintaining your anonymity, will give you the greatest tactical advantage in any emergency situation. And that's going to be it for me. So if you found this information useful, give me the old controlled pair on the like and subscribe buttons. And if you found this information useful enough that you want to buy me a beer about it, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. So until next time, this is James Merritt for Readiness Nation, reminding you to always be the master of your fate and the captain of your soul.